It's fair to say that 2019 ended up being a banner year for Western fans of Square Enix's long-running Mana series. After 24 whole years of remaining a Japanese exclusive, the series' elusive third game, the Super Famicom Seiken Densetsu 3, finally landed outside of Japan as part of the newly localized collection of Mana for the Nintendo Switch. Rebranded as Trials of Mana for its Western debut, that wasn't the only Seiken Densetsu 3 related bombshell Square Enix dropped during E3 2019. As it turned out, a full 3D remake of the same game was also revealed to be in development, and now that remake is here. But is it worth your time? Well, considering the disastrous 2018 remake of the widely loved Secret of Mana failed to live up to the original in just about every possible way, you'd be forgiven for assuming the answer to that question is no right out of the gate. But on the contrary, I'm happy to report that the Trials of Mana remake amounts to a far more ambitious effort than what came before, more than justifying its existence as a contemporary 3D interpretation of a Super Famicom classic. It's important to establish right off the bat what kind of remake we're talking about with Trials of Mana here. This isn't like Final Fantasy VII Remake, where certain creative liberties were taken to diverge from the source material in significant and unexpected ways. Other than an original post-game scenario including new story content and character classes that becomes available after the credits roll, which I sadly can't talk about for this review, Trials of Mana is more or less a one-to-one remake of the original version. That's not to say it's completely the same. Obviously, the game world has been rebuilt in 3D for modern hardware with all the presentational differences that implies, and the battle system has been reimagined with a greater focus on the action part of action RPG than ever before. But pretty much everything else closely mirrors that of the original, from the story and characters to area layouts and overall progression. Even the script, which now features full voice acting for each cutscene, is in many cases a word-for-word reproduction of the English localization recently seen in Collection of Mana. That also means Trials of Mana's offbeat approach of having the player pick their own main character and 2 support characters from a cast of 6 heroes is carried over in full. This is an interesting wrinkle because it means that your path through the game, right down to the final boss you eventually face, can vary significantly depending on which of Trials of Mana's playable characters you choose to journey with at the onset. And because each character also feels meaningfully unique to play as in battle, with their own bespoke weapon types, combos, and potential class changes, this choice feels like it really matters and it reverberates throughout the game in myriad ways. You literally can't see everything Trials of Mana has to offer in one go, and that's by design, encouraging multiple trips through the game with different characters to experience the entirety of it all. And with my first playthrough clocking in at a relatively lean 25 to 30 hours, that's not an incredibly tall order. This drives the game's replay value up through the roof, and while I consider that a good thing, there are minor drawbacks to be aware of on the narrative side for those who take a one-and-done approach to their games. Because of the nature of Trials of Mana's story being shared among 6 main characters, you only experience events from the perspectives of your own chosen heroes. While you do sometimes cross paths with the heroes you didn't choose, you miss out on any story events and cutscenes that pertain specifically to them, which can lead to some confusing encounters later in the game as you puzzle over the motivations of characters you've barely met and have little context for. For example, my party of Reese, Hawkeye, and Charlotte encountered Duran multiple times and I was able to glean what he was about, but Kevin only appeared briefly and they never met Angela even once, so there were definitely some holes in my narrative experience. That said, Trials of Mana's story is relatively basic and straightforward to begin with, so even if you never experience it from every possible perspective, it never feels like you're missing out on too much, and the game is built in such a way that the journey feels satisfying even if you only play the game once. While Trials of Mana's story, characters, and overall structure remain mostly unchanged from the Super Famicom version, the moment-to-moment gameplay has undergone some serious modernization. The game still transitions in and out of battle seamlessly as you encounter enemies in the field, and the action can be paused at any time to select items, abilities, and spells from a ring-shaped command menu, but combat is much more oriented toward pure action here than it was in the original. Each character has weak and strong attacks that can be chained together to create different combos, and there's now a dodge roll mechanic that you'll need to get very comfortable with in order to avoid enemy attacks in real time, especially the screen-filling spells slung at you later in the game. Enemy area of effect attacks are helpfully telegraphed by red impact zones, so dodging properly feels like a rewarding feedback loop of action and reaction rather than guesswork. You can also cancel out of most combos by dodge rolling, which emphasizes even further how action-oriented the combat is here in the Trials of Mana remake compared to the more start and stop nature of the original. Meanwhile, switching controls between your party's characters is instant and can be done at any time, with the AI controlling whoever you're not playing as at the moment, and doing so surprisingly well. The game also offers various options for tweaking the AI's behavior to your liking if you so choose, but it must be said that even if the AI isn't perfect, it's good enough that I almost never felt the need to bother customizing it. While the battle mechanics themselves are rock solid then, problems unfortunately arise in the form of pacing and difficulty. Speaking to the former, Trials of Mana is what you might call a slow burn. Not in a narrative sense necessarily, but a gameplay one. Combat remains extremely basic and the threat posed by enemies essentially non-existent until about 10 or so hours into the game, when your characters achieve their first class change and gain access to new abilities and magic. Class changes work exactly like they did in the original, with each character being able to evolve into an upgraded class once certain conditions are met. The catch is that these class upgrades are divided between light and dark versions, and the one you choose for your first change will determine your available choices for your second class change, while others are locked away. This dovetails perfectly with the game's existing emphasis on replayability, and the differences between classes go far beyond cosmetics and have a genuine impact on how your characters grow and perform in battle. Although the combat benefits enormously from this newly added depth and the various nuances that come with it, the overall difficulty balance unfortunately never quite manages to keep up. While the rest of the game is certainly harder than everything before that first class change, requiring you to do more than just button mash your way through each enemy, I never came even close to getting a game over except for a single boss fight that proved to be the exception and not the rule. And it wasn't even the final boss. It should be noted though that these complaints are all based on a complete playthrough of the game on its normal difficulty level, which I used as the baseline for this review. Thankfully the difficulty can be raised or lowered on the fly, and based on my own experiences, genre veterans will probably want to start out on the hard difficulty, and as a matter of fact, that's exactly what I plan to do when I replay the game with the 3 heroes I didn't choose the first time around. That's right, despite any criticisms I've leveled against the Trials of Mana remake in this review, I've enjoyed my time with it enough that I eventually want to replay it with the heroes I didn't choose for my first playthrough so I can more fully experience the game as a whole. And the biggest reason for that, for me at least, is because of how focused, streamlined, and unflinchingly old school this remake actually is. Square Enix wisely chose not to overcomplicate this remake simply to try and innovate for innovation's sake. Character growth couldn't be more straightforward. Gaining experience points and leveling up rewards a character with training points you can spend on attributes like strength, stamina, and intelligence, earning them abilities, spells, and passive buffs related to each attribute along the way. The various fields and dungeons you traverse all have areas to explore off the main path that reward you with treasure and other perks, but none are so large as to be overwhelming, and there's always a marker pointing you toward the next story destination if you want to stay focused on the critical path. Some might consider these things to be markers of limiting or backwards game design that should stay in the past where they belong, but I strongly disagree. I find it comforting, refreshing even, to play a game in 2020 that feels like it came out a few generations ago and revels in that fact. While this is definitely a lower budget game by Square Enix standards, and that can be seen in some muddy textures, somewhat simple level geometry, and stilted cutscene animation, the game is nonetheless pleasing to the eyes overall and ably carries forth the vibrant, hyper-colorful aesthetic the Mana series is known for. As for performance, the PS4 version, which is what I played for this review, runs at a silky smooth 60 frames per second on the PS4 Pro with no hint of slowdown even when fights get hectic. Trials of Mana's soundtrack, meanwhile, excels on 2 fronts. You can choose to play with a rearranged soundtrack or the original Super Famicom tunes and can switch between the two on the fly, which I love. But most importantly, they're both actually viable options this time. While the recent Secret of Mana remake was plagued by a rearranged soundtrack that was so terrible it was downright offensive at times, the rearranged music in Trials of Mana hews much more closely to and successfully captures the tone of the original tracks, offering a distinct and perfectly viable alternative. The supervision of original Trials of Mana composer Hiroki Kikuta can be felt throughout, and the rearranged soundtrack is much better off for it. And on that note, fellow video game music fans, let me be the first to tell you that yes, the remake version of The Sacrifice Part 3 delivers in a tremendous way. I'm not quite sure what to say about the English voice acting though. Some of it is good, much of it is bad, and all of it is baffling.
I hear ya. That lady royally messed up the Firestone. Take me with you. Then we can all make her pay. She's gonna get it.
Glad to see you fired up!
You ain't seen nothing yet.
While the budget here was clearly limited and A-list voice actors were definitely not hired for this remake, the problem to me seems to be more about flawed voice direction than the actors themselves. It's not uncommon, for example, for the same character to sound surprisingly good in one cutscene, only for them to fall completely flat in another. It's strange to behold, and while I actually ended up kind of enjoying the English dub in its own bizarre way, the superior Japanese voice track is thankfully included for those who would prefer to utilize it. After a remake of Secret of Mana that could kindly be considered a misfire, it's a relief to see this series find its footing again with Trials of Mana. I like it. The elements that made the original Super Famicom version so unique, such as the class change system and interwoven game structure built for multiple playable characters, are reproduced here faithfully, resulting in a remake that's just as primed for multiple replays as the original game. While some significant pacing issues do mask and undermine the battle system's depth for the game's first several hours and then some, and the more action-focused gameplay may prove divisive among fans of the original, the combat feels meaningfully improved overall and the game kept me engaged more than enough to see it through. Benefiting especially from a design ethos that is firmly and shamelessly rooted in simpler times, Trials of Mana may not reinvent the wheel or necessarily blow you away, but it's pure gaming comfort food that successfully revitalizes and modernizes a classic from a bygone era. Hey, thanks so much for watching. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell to get notified when we publish new content. Otherwise, keep it on GameXplain for more on the Mana series and all things gaming.